video, we'll look at climate and other predictions that have been made with the increase in CO2.
Carbon could cost us the planet.
Mr. Vice President, if we don't act now, it's going to be too late.
Let's have a look at the areas that we're going to cover and the predictions that have been made. Starting with climate. And what about droughts? Droughts are expected to increase. Famines. The polar bear population, is it getting better or weaker? Sea level. Much has been said about sea level. The ice caps on the North and South Poles. Extreme weather events such as hurricanes. So let's take a look first at climate. The future climate is based on IPCC climate models, and we can see a brief comparison with the climate reality of the past. And these climate models, which are represented past 2012, they operate on the basis of having different input parameters. The different RCP values indicate a different set of parameters assumed. And as you can see, that there's quite a variability in the computer model output across these 20 models. The one that's of greatest interest in today's media is the starting conditions of RCP P8.5 is a highly energy intensive scenario as a result of high population growth and a lower rate of technology development. This is the most severe forecast in climate. RCP 8.5 assumes a very high CO2 level, much higher than the other values, more than 2x the current CO2 level. RCP 8.5 has consequently been called the return to coal scenario, since coal is the primary energy source. In this particular graph, we see a more recent computer model output as also compared with observations. And this spans a shorter time scale. The red curve is the average of 102 climate models, and the green and blue represent observed values, both balloon datasets and satellite datasets. And as you can see, there's quite a disparity between the model output and the observed values. This does not bode well for having the models represent accurately what is going to be the climate of the near future. So the question then remains, how well do these models represent the climate at the end of this century? Moving along, we now take a look at sea level. Sea level historically has been quite variable. As you can see, back in the period of time of 20,000 years ago, the last glacial maximum brought us a sea level reduction of 120 meters. That's a fairly sizable reduction. And since that period of time, the sea level has risen as this particular glacial mass has melted until about 8,000 years ago, and now we're starting to see a much slower growth in the sea level. And in more recent times, what we're seeing is a 1 to 3 millimeter per year increase, and it's been very stable. That does not stop people from predicting that New York City would be underwater with a 20-foot increase in the sea level in and around New York City. But as we also look at the NOAA data for the past period of time, start to see a no sea level rise in the last 2 years and a fairly expected level over the last several decades. This doesn't keep people again from forecasting and dramatizing huge increases in sea level. Will we see a more than foot increase in sea level? Probably not. We look at other sea level predictions. One was made back in 1988 about the Maldives. A gradual rise in average sea level is threatening to consequently cover this Indian nation of almost 1,200 islands, when in fact actually the shoreline was extended because of the geological activities and the raising of the islands. So really, the Maldives island is rising relative to the sea level. This is not always true. So geological activity does indeed affect the sea level. Let's have a look at droughts and the history of droughts. As you can see, in this particular time period of 1982 to 2012, there has been no increase in droughts. This would be the time period during which, if this was highly sensitive to CO2 levels, we would see this, but in fact we have not. There has not been an increase in either severe or not so severe drought levels. If we look at snowfall, some of the predictions that were made, there will never be snow again in England. Well, that has not indeed turned out to be the case. And as you can see in this particular graphic representation for Northern Hemisphere, the snow extent has actually increased. There are other predictions that were not made that could have been, such as in the Sahara. We've seen up to 3 feet of snow in the Sahara in January of 2017, and another instance of snow in December of 2018. Let's have a quick look at major climate events. It was expected that during the time when CO2 was increasing, that the cyclones would actually become much worse. And as you can see in this graph, spanning 1970 to nearly 2018, we're seeing the accumulated cyclone energy as not having an upward trend. In fact, more recently, having a downward trend. And this is also represented, this same trend is represented in the number of events of both tropical storms and hurricanes. Florida had, as one headline had depicted, Florida has had 119 hurricanes since 1850, but only the last one was clearly due to climate change. This is indeed not very instructive. In this particular graph, we're taking a look at the annual cumulative tornado trend. And as of October 3rd, 2018, we're seeing that the lowest count has occurred in 65 years of record keeping. So we're not seeing an upward trend also in the severity and number of tornadoes. Let's have a look also at the hockey stick. Let's have a look at the hockey stick, centerpiece for movie Inconvenient Truth and for the IPCC report AR number 3. As you can see in this particular depiction, this is a span of temperature as represented in the so-called hockey stick from 1000 AD to around current time. As you can see that the data in blue is historic records and the data from thermometers is in red. So these are two different data sets. This has come under close scrutiny and was very much dramatized in the movie Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore. But in actual fact, what we're seeing in various representations is that the temperature record was modified to eliminate the medieval warm period, where it was shown that Vikings did colonize Greenland and a lot of activity occurred. And in this representation, the red curve represents that more representative set of data covering Greenland and other parts of the world that experienced the medieval warm period as compared to the modified temperature records put forth in the so-called hockey stick. There's a lot of controversy over this, both in terms of how the statistical techniques were done and indeed the actual data itself. Let's have a look at polar bears. Polar bears, Susan Crickford examined the polar bears around the North Pole and found that in various areas where the ice was actually thinning, that the populations all increased except the one with the thicker ice. This was not expected by the IPCC and other estimations. Modeled polar bear population was expected to experience a 38% reduction in population, but in fact the population went up by 16%. And although Michael Mann may consider the fact that we're all polar bears, indeed that doesn't appear to be the case. Let's turn to other gems from Al Gore. And in 2006, he stated, as he is more currently, unless drastic measures are made to reduce greenhouse gases within the next 10 years, the world will reach a point of no return. In 2008, he predicted that the entire North Polar Cap would be gone in 5 years. Indeed, it has not, and has stayed relatively constant up through 2016, and subsequently went through a dip and has risen back again. Polar bears want to express the fact that when Al Gore was born, there were 7,000 of them. Today, only 30,000 remain. Let's have a look at the greening of the planet and how this affects famines or lack thereof. What we're seeing in this depiction is for the last several decades, from 1982 to 2015, we've seen a general greening of the planet. There's been a fairly substantial increase in the leaf area as measured by satellites. And in this depiction of some actual measured results, we're seeing that the CO2 increase operates like plant food. This is what happens with more CO2, or a set of trees were exposed to different levels of CO2, and you can see that the tremendous growth increase. So we're seeing that enhanced plant growth with more CO2 across all plant life. And in fact, plants require less water if they're operating in an environment of increased CO2. So what are the bottom line messages here? Is the Earth uninhabitable unless we drastically reduce CO2? This is what we have been told, that famine, economic collapse, a sun that cooks us, and a number of other maladies would wreak havoc upon us. Try to summarize what we're learning and should be learning in this particular discussion around climate and the predictions. Some things you are hearing is that we face massive crises if we do not kill fossil fuels in 10 years. You can be the judge of that. Need to spend countless trillions to make the world have low emissions. The world economies would be thwarted and chaos would indeed ensue. Why is not all of this being discussed? Well, aspects you're not hearing. It's altogether likely that the increased CO2 results in a 1 degree centigrade increase or less. Increased ability to feed the world and improve the way of life across the entire planet. World's maximum population could very well be kept below 9.5 billion, currently 7.6 billion. The RCP 8.5 assumption is that the world's population would rise to 12 billion. Poverty would greatly be reduced and technology innovation accelerated should we not accept the idea of drastic measures. Again, why is this not being discussed in its entirety or even at all? So clearly, we should all pay close attention to the various climate change.
Did you know that man-caused climate change is resulting in less snowfall, but also more snowfall? Or that it leads to drought, except when it leads to flooding? Or that it causes more hurricanes or fewer hurricanes?
Question and learn. Once again, that is the bottom line. Thanks again to John Stossel, Mark Bonanno,